We've been going through the LAM.RIM a little bit each week. So now we're at the section on how to sustain a meditation session. So this is within the section on the how to relate to a spiritual teacher, but it's not directly related to it. The section on how to relate to the teacher, then it has two sections: the actual manner of relating to a teacher, and then a little bit about how to sustain a meditation session. Because that's the first. This is the first section in the LAM.RIM.CHEN.MO where he gives a major topic for contemplation. So in the context of that, then Tsongkhapa goes into a digression about how to sustain a meditation session. But it's not actually exclusive to this section. It's applicable to any of the later sections. As he explains here, even he shows that there's the general way of sustaining a meditation session, then he has a little bit about specifically how to meditate on the devotion to the teacher, but that's a very small part of it. We've already passed that. So this section had the preparatory practices, which is the 6 preparatory practices called Jorchu that one does before doing meditation, such as cleaning the place and arranging the altar, and so forth. And then the actual meditation session, which we did already, and then what to do between sessions. So that's what we're in now. There's a lot about how to guard your mind between meditation sessions. As some of you might know, it's quite important. It's not possible just to sit down and have your mind perfectly focused if you don't sustain anything during the post-session. So it's pretty much about going through your day-to-day activities and how to do so in a way that will be conducive to being able to meditate properly. So, as you know, we have the 3 higher trainings of ethical discipline, concentration, and insight. So these sort of relate to both of the first 2. Most of it is about ethical discipline, how to guard yourself, but that then relates directly to concentration, because without guarding yourself, then it's not possible to attain concentration. The mind will just naturally be distracted to objects. So we have here Zhenyang. So what I've been doing is reading the text in Tibetan, but then I'll tell you what it means in English, because most of the students here, they're learning Tibetan, so it's a good practice for us. So Zhenyang, Jinet Han Lak Tangi Lam, Te Lak Tu Kepe Gyur Gepe Tsok Shi Layang, La Perchade. So likewise, you have to practice the 4 collections of causes that make it easy to generate calm abiding and special insight. So these 4, Wombogo Dampatang, Shejindu Tripatang, Segitsurik Patang, Minyawa Naljula Tsunjing, Nyawetse Dira Chawahu. So the first one, Wombogo Damba, that is guarding your sense doors. And then Shejindu Chupa is acting with introspection. So as I think I said before, I like to translate Shejin, as some people do, as introspection. Shejin, it just literally means like in accordance with the mind, like the mind. But the idea is that you're aware of what's happening. That's how it's defined, is you're aware of what's happening in your mind. So that's one of the 3 main mental factors that's considered essential as the basis for any kind of meditation practice. The first one being mindfulness, which is literally remembrance, memory, meaning that you remember what you're trying to do. If you keep losing yourself, if you're trying to stay focused, but you keep forgetting that's what you're trying to do, then it's impossible to stay focused. Then Shejin means you're aware of what's happening in your mind, so that if you aren't aware that you have anger or attachment and those are motivating forces, then you'll be controlled by them. And also you have to have some kind of eye ahead of you. You have to see things that are arising even before they come, so that you can stop them before they become very strong. Like when I was taught to drive, I was told you can't just look at the car in front of you. You have to look many cars in front of you to know what's happening up there when there's going to be a backup. So likewise, when you're meditating, you have to know what's happening in your mind as acutely as possible. And then the third, this is not a list here, I'm just saying that the third mental factor then is bayu, right, which is conscientiousness, which means that being very careful about everything you do, not just even for small things. So, for example, when you open a door, so some of you might know Thich Nhat Hanh was quite renowned for his mindfulness practice, and Thich Nhat Hanh had said that the Christian monk Thomas Merton, who was his friend, he said that Thomas Merton had said to somebody else, Thich Nhat Hanh was reporting this, he said, you can tell from the way Thich Nhat Hanh opens a door that he's a true monk. So the point being that you're very aware of every single action you do. So Thich Nhat Hanh, he would often say that you invite the door to open, you don't open the door. So everything you do is very purposeful. You don't just think this is unimportant and I need to get to my meditation cushion, so I'm rushing to get there. Everything you do on the way, you're very attentive to every action and how your body movements are affecting the things around you. So that's Sheijin du Chipa is the second one. And then Segitsurikpa is knowing the right amount of food to eat. And so it's very important to know not to eat too much, not to eat too little. That will affect significantly. And not just food, I think you can also think about it as health in general. How to manage your body such that you can sustain your meditation practice. And then Minyewa Neljulitsun, so then putting effort into the yogic practice of not sleeping. And then Nyewet Seijidar Chawar, and then what to do when you do sleep. So it doesn't mean you don't sleep at all necessarily, unless you're very advanced. But to limit your sleep, not to sleep too much. And then when you do sleep, how to sleep in a way that will sustain your practice. So Dambola Ngale, so first is guarding your senses. So Gangi Dompani, so it says who is guarding your senses, or with what do you guard your senses? So yeah, it's with what here, Gangi. So Trempa Kundu Zumatang. So guarding mindfulness. So being very careful to maintain your mindfulness. Like I said, it's mindfulness here. So sometimes it's an understanding in modern meditation presentations that mindfulness means that you're very aware of what's going on around you, or just every single moment. Which in general, that's a good quality to cultivate, but that's not actually what mindfulness means. The word means remembrance. So in the context of this, it's saying that if you don't remember that you're trying to guard your senses, then you won't. So you have to remember the instructions and remember what is the advice, what are the different things that you're supposed to be trying to cultivate. Otherwise, it's not very useful to receive the advice if you don't remember it actively, or active memory. Not just enough to say when somebody gives you a test and you can fill out the answers and you know how to guard yourself, but you have to remember it when you're actually in the field, so to speak. And then Chempala Dog Chepaho, so then always actualizing mindfulness, Dog Chepaho. So then la Damboni, so the first one is Dambakundusuma, so guarding mindfulness. So Wampo go dombale tsampe chunam. So all things that you do on the basis of guarding your senses. Mijepa yang yang kyongho. You need to keep sustaining that you don't forget them. So that's exactly the point. There's all these points about how to guard your senses, but you have to make sure that you always remember what those are. So then Nipani, the second one, which is always actualizing mindfulness. Trempa de la Gundu Tang Gupar Kyalmoho. This is what we call Gyunjor and Dagjor. The two kinds of application. If you ever study the concentrations and formless absorptions, then you'll get to this term. So Gyunjor and Dagjor, Gyunjor and Gujor, which are also called Dagjor and Dejor. There's several, and there's different words for them. So Gyunjor means continuous application. Right? So Gyun in Tibetan, it means continual. So it's not enough just to do it very strongly for one day. You need to have it sustained over a long time. And then Gujor is devoted application, or they said the Dejor is the other one, like faithful. So you need to Yeah, you need to do it with strong effort. So those are the two sides of it. It's not enough just to be very strong for one day, and it's not enough to sustain it for a long time, but be very weak. You have to have both. Now, it's said in that context I was talking about with the concentrations that you can have one or the other. If you just have continuous application, then you get that's sort of the lowest level. If you just have strong application, I think if you just have the strong application, that's the lowest level. Then if you just have continuous, that's the second. And then if you have both of them together, then you'll have the strongest concentration as a result of your practice. So then that was Gangi Dompa, right? So with what do you guard it? It's basically with mindfulness is how you guard your senses. And then Gang Dompani is what do you guard? Wompo Druko. So your 6 sense doors, meaning your eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and then mind, right? That you guard what thoughts you're having. That's probably the most important one. So Gan Le Dompani is from what do you guard it? Yul Druk Idu Onwatang Mi Onwale. So from the pleasing and unpleasant. I Onwa in Tibetan is quite explicit, more so than the word pleasing in Tibetan, because I Ong means mind come. So it makes your mind want to go to it. And Yidu Mi Onwa means mind not come. You want to not be involved in that because it's ugly to you. So you have of the 6 senses again. So things that you see, that this thing is pleasing to me, so I'm attracted to it, and this thing is ugly to me, so I keep distance from it. And the other senses, but then also with your mind. So you're thinking about this thought that's very interesting, and you get very distracted on that. Again, that's the most difficult one. And then Jitar Dampalani. So then the way that you do it, right? So we had with what do you guard, from what do you guard, and how do you guard it? Jitar Dampalani, right? Wompo Sumwar Chipani. So then guarding your senses. Number So it's saying you get the 6 consciousnesses are generated on the basis of the object and the sense power. Right? This is in the sutra. This is part also the Buddha was echoing ancient Indian philosophy. There was a lot of questions about what is the cause of mind. So in Buddhist philosophy, it's pretty much called the 3 conditions for any moment of mind to arise, which is the object has to be an object that triggers the mind, and then the power. There has to be some kind of sense power, or in the case of the mind, what's called a mental power, something that. So the sense powers, of course, in traditional Buddhist philosophy, they're said to be subtle form. Now, in modern parlance, we might talk about the eye. There's a question about how that relates to each other. That's a little different. But the main point is you have to have, for example, if you don't have functioning eyes, then even if you have objects, you're not going to see anything. And then for this mental sense power, we might think about it as the brain. That, at least for gross consciousness, it requires a functioning brain to function. Otherwise, if the brain is damaged, then the consciousness is very much impaired. But then the third, which he doesn't mention here, but the third condition is the previous moment of consciousness. So this is quite different than modern scientific presentations where they talk about only those first 2. So you have to have a continuum of consciousness. It's not enough just to have eyes and an external object. There has to be the substantial cause of consciousness. And those 3 together, if they meet, so like you have the 12 links of dependent origination, you have the sixth link is contact, right? So the contact means the meeting of those 3, right? Contact doesn't mean you touch the table. It means that you meet the meeting of the object, the sense power, and the previous moment of consciousness. When those 3 come together, then you generate experience. So he's saying at the jukdu, like right after that's generated, then ishe you don't want druk tang. So the mental consciousness, right? So after any sense consciousness or mental consciousness that you have, immediately after that, then you have a mental consciousness analyzing, this is good, this is bad. So yido onwa druk tang, yido mi onwa druk la chakpatang, dawa, kewar gilbert. So then you get attachment to the what's pleasing and hatred, or really just aversion towards what is displeasing. So it's saying here that the desire and hatred or attachment and aversion are qualities of the mental consciousness, which is generally the case. So that, however, it also is talked about that you can have an eye consciousness, for example, that has desire. But that only happens because of the mental consciousness. The eye consciousness cannot generate desire, but if there's very strong desire in the mental consciousness, then it'll impact the eye consciousness, and then it'll perceive things as more pleasant than they are. And likewise, it said it can actually cause incorrect perception. You can perceive things incorrectly due to strong attachment or strong aversion, because it'll impair the sense power. So that's again something worth looking at. There's a lot of studies about how people perceive things, perception of different objects depending on their mental state. So then dele beper chempo mikewa sungo ho. So he's saying that happens. You're not necessarily able to control that. If you see an object, unless you wanted to sit with your eyes closed all the time, you're going to see objects, and occasionally your mind is going to be attached to them. It's quite hard to stop that immediate process. But he's saying when that happens, then with strong effort, you should try to stop that from increasing. Right? So when you see that your mind, so this is why you have to have this shijin, the introspection. You have to know I'm getting attached to this object. Then you immediately are able to control it and not let it get out of hand. So wampo druki kyang dompa drupa chipa ni. So then also with the way that you guard with the six sense powers. So it's saying whatever you're going to look at, right? You're thinking you want to look at this particular thing. So that the object that if you look at it, then it would generate afflictions in your mind, right? So the definition of an affliction is that which disturbs the mind, disturbs the peace of mind. So that includes attachment, anger, and so forth. Their mere generation causes the mind to be disturbed. So nyon mon. So he's saying you have to know what objects are going to generate that. Is just by seeing them, you'll generate affliction. So namo wampo mitonwa gopaho. So then you stop yourself from engaging with them, right? So if you know that if I look at this object, I'm going to have attachment, then you try not to look at it very much. That's generally good advice. It doesn't mean that, of course, you're going to eventually see things that make you attached. You can't just, again, unless you're in retreat, you can't just sit in your room all day and not engage objects. But in general, you want to do as much as you can to be aware. This object is something that I'm very attached to, or this person, I get very angry when I see them. Then if you can't control yourself, it's better to try to avoid seeing them as much as possible. Otherwise, you'll see that it disturbs your mind. It will, as much as you have control of the situation, it's best to try to avoid that. It's not going to benefit to excite the afflictions. So then, wampo suma deyang. So then, also regarding this guarding of the senses, yu truk la tsema tang niduk mizinching. Sorry, mizinching. Right. So, you don't hold on the objects. You don't hold signs and marks. I guess you could say they both kind of translate the same way. But the idea is that you don't apprehend things on them that are projections, right? So often semar zimpa often means like taking them to be truly existent. It's another way of expressing that, because they hold something. You hold them as truly real in a way that's not coming from the outside of the object. So mi jin ching jing e tang yomobu long way tikpe sem jumiang gompa chepe drupo. Right, so it's just talking about afflictions in general. So not just true existence, but you project other qualities onto the object. So you see the object as more attractive than it is, or more ugly than it actually is. So threatening. So you try to avoid that. And if out of forgetfulness or out of afflictions, strong afflictions, then you do generate some kind of non-virtuous mind, then you should immediately try to guard yourself. So if you notice that immediately I'm projecting onto this object, then you try to guard yourself from acting on that projection. So then he says right here, what is Semra Zimpa? What is Ngondaksu Zimpa? So Semra Zimpa means holding signs. So Tawa Michawi Sukla Sopa Yudu Chipa. So if you do happen to engage as an object a form that you are trying not to look at, or Yul Nawanam, or whatever appears to your mind, Dera Jungwa Hila Chipa, Monsu de Chene Tomo Ho. So that you see that has arisen, and you with attention, you recognize that that's happening. I think that so I see. The point is that you want to try to avoid that happening, right? So it's what happens is when these objects come, you give attention to them, and you put your mind on them. And then Ngondaksu Zimpa. So what is Ngondaksu Zimpa? Shepa Drugi Druk Du. So at the end of the six consciousnesses, right? So when you get any of those six consciousnesses, as I was saying above, Chakdam Mongsum Kewe Yula. So then there's an object to which you get attachment or aversion or confusion or ignorance. Yula Igi Shepe Zimpaham. So the Ngondaksu Zimpa is when your mind engages with that. You get attachment, and then you take hold of that and you kind of go along with that. You use your Zimpaham. So then even if the object doesn't appear directly, so then even that you don't see it, but you just hear somebody talking about it. That can happen. You're very attached to something, you just hear somebody talking about that person or that thing, and immediately it triggers this process in your mind. So it's engaging with that process. That's what's talking about Ngondaksu Zimpa. So that's again what you're trying to avoid as much as possible. So Dompa Gang Yimpani. So then what is this guarding? It's saying Nyomon Le Yi Sungne. So you guard your mind away from afflictions. Nyomon Chen. And the Gewaham Lumba Denla Joboho. And then you place it on either a virtuous object or at least on something neutral. So dear Madribe Lumba Denla Jopani. So you place it says something that is neutral and unobscured. Right? The point being, unobscured is related to afflictions, right? Dripa. So you can have an affliction that's not non-virtuous, right? So, for example, the apprehension of true existence, the apprehension of a self, is not non-virtuous. It's naturally neutral, because it can lead to virtue or non-virtue. Out of a view of true existence, you can still practice virtue. Most people, that's what they do when they practice virtue. They believe what they're practicing virtue towards is a truly existent thing. And likewise, some other afflictions, especially those related to higher realms, it said, like the form and formless realm, those are not non-virtuous, because there's no non-virtue related to the higher realms. It's purely virtuous in terms of what causes it, but they're neutral. An affliction can't be virtuous, but they're neutral minds. They don't cause either happiness or suffering. It's still not something desirable, though, because it's what we call the pervasive suffering of conditioning, or pervasive compounding suffering, that it just perpetuates samsara. It keeps the mind in a limited state. So eventually it will lead to suffering, because eventually the state will exhaust itself. It's like going to sleep. Right? You can go to sleep all you want, and there's no non-virtue per se, but when you wake up, you're going to have to deal with things again. So it's not, in that sense, it's a dripa lungmaten in that context, right? It's an obscured kind of neutrality. So here it's saying a neutral thing that's not obscure. You don't want to place your mind on an affliction, but place it on something neutral that can at least, like, for example, they talk about the breath. Just focus on your breath. If you're very angry and you can't think of anything else, just focus on your breath. So, sem gewe mikpala zinbe tu mingi cholana. So that's saying, at the time when you can't apprehend, you're not observing a virtuous object, at the very least observe something neutral. Cholana so pe kapsuo. So like when you're doing different daily activities. So if you're doing something, you can't focus on virtue, at least keep your mind in a neutral state and don't let it incline toward non-virtue. So then Jeju de Chupa. So next we come. So we had this Wampo Go Damba, right, guarding the senses. And then Sheijin de Chupa means how to practice introspection. So the Ni it also has 2. So Ganda Chupe Ji, so the basis upon which you practice this. And then De La Chupe Jeijin, so then the introspection that does practice that on the basis of this thing. So that the basis on which you practice introspection again is twofold. Ni. Gyu tan dembe le nga tan. Gyua tan dembe le nga means the 5 activities related to movement. And then chupa tan dembe le nga ho, so the 5 activities related to behavior. So the dambo nge le lugi le ni, so then the first 5 has the first one of the first 5, or we'll just list them first. So lugi le, so activities of body. Miki le, the activities of your eyes, which is quite important because you notice how much your eyes will determine what you focus on. And then yen lak tam ing lak tam chigileni, so then your limbs and your secondary limbs, which means you have your limbs as your arms and your legs, and your secondary limbs as your fingers and your toes. Right? And then chugu ta lungzegi se. So then this is probably more relevant to monks, right? So your robes and your bowl, your begging bowl, right? So the way to behave with those. And then sonyam gile, which is about begging. So again, this is generally, of course, written for in the context for monks. So I think he doesn't say this specifically, but most of what he's taking here is I think from Labdu, right? The compendium of training by Shantideva, and also most likely from Kundu, right? The what's it? Abhidhamma Samuchaya by Asanga, right? The compendium of Ngompa Kundu. So compendium of Abhidharma, manifest knowledge. So those are 2 very important Indian texts that have a lot about practice, how to guard yourself, especially during meditation. So those texts were generally written for monastics, and that's why there's that emphasis here. So lugi le, so first activities of body. Tong tang tsukla kangla sopa shendu par drogatang. So then going to another place like a city or a temple, and it ate sur dopo, and then coming back. So those are the 5. He doesn't explain here what to do with them. He's just saying those are 5 activities, and later he'll say during those how you behave. And then miki le, so then the activities of the eyes. Lo ngondu ma tongwa, you not so patongwe chungse depatang. So this is when you don't actually intentionally look at something, but all kinds of things appear to you, and you have a little bit of attention to it, just because it's just appearing to you. And then lo ngondu tongne tongwe nampa depaho. So then when you actually focus your attention on something and look at it directly. So then yen lak tang yin lak tamche. So then the way your limbs and your secondary limbs. Yen lak tang ling lak tianwa tang kumbaho. So there's 2. One is extending them and one is retracting them. And then chugu tong lungzegi leni. So then your robes and your bowl, chugu sum, your 3 robes. So for a gelong, the 3 robes is the shamtab, right? And then what we call chugu now, but it should be called lagu. Right? We call it chugu, but chugu is the general word for the robes. But in modern parlance, we generally use chugu for the inner upper robe, but it should be called the lagu. Right? And the shamtab actually should be called tangu. I said shamtab, but the shamtab actually in the Vinaya, your shamtab is what we now call the mayo, right? Your underrobe. But the shamtab, the tango is what we now call shamtab. And then the lagu is the upper, and then the namjar, that's the same nowadays and before, is the outer upper robe. So if you're a Gitsu, you have 2 of those, and if you're Gelong, you have 3, and if you're Gelongma, you have 5, but he doesn't talk about that here. So that's the Chugu Sum, Tangu, Lagu, Namjar. And then Lungze, so the Lungze is the begging bowl. It's pretty clear. Lung is drop, and se is to catch. So drop, catch. Put it in your bowl. So long chepa tang changwa chewa. So the way to utilize them, and then the way to hold them. So then sonyam gile, and then the way of going for alms. So tung sok so. So the way of eating and drinking, meaning that not just asking for, but when you go, if you're a monastic and you eat at a layperson's home, how to behave and with the proper manners such that you don't offend them. So then we have Sukla Kang Le Chupe Le Ging Nge Le Dambo. So then we have the 5 activities of the how to behave in a temple. Right, so before it just said chupa dandapila, the activities of moving, which we just had, and activities of behavior. But here, it's saying it's specifically behavior in relation to a temple, when you're at a temple. Or Chuklakan can really mean a monastery too. In the Vinaya, it usually is talking about a monastery, as opposed to literally the temple. Right, the word Suklakang, right, Suk means crown and Lak means hand, but it means the Ka Tengyur, right? The Kangyur and the Tengyur, which we have here. So that's what makes it a Suklakang. If you have the Kangyur Tengyur, the collected teachings, then that makes it a Suklakang, and then you can put a special flag on top, the banner. But in a more general way, Suklakang just means a temple, but then as I say, in the Vinaya, it's used it's used more just for a monastery itself. So it's really talking here how to behave in the monastery. I think the idea is that you can divide it into 2, right? Generally, the monk's behavior is how to behave when you're out of the monastery and how to behave when you're in the monastery. So I think the gyua, the moving here, is when you're out of the monastery, and then here is how to behave when you're in the monastery. So chaksana, chapaham, so when you're walking along a walking path, to begin to droaham, or if you go to before somebody to receive some kind of dharma activity or dharma teaching, and chugi chir lamdu shupe somatang, or when you're going along the path in order for a dharma purpose, and a chaksa chutumpa tuntupa can. So then the person who's walking, manner of walking is in accordance with the dharma. Or you could also say chutumpa can also just mean in accordance with the virtue, right? The word chu, dharma, it is dharma, but in English, dharma we usually say is like the teachings or the realizations, but also dharma often just means virtue. Right? So in a virtuous way of behaving. Ken lo tumpa agonda. Chaksa chu tumpa. Ken lo. So it's not tumpa ken. It's ken lo lama. Right. So the ken lo. These are your teachers, right? Your kempo is your abbot. Your lopon is your preceptor, and your lama is your teacher. I think we talked about that before. You have in the monastery generally, you have several different kinds of teachers as a monk, but mainly you have 5: the kempo, and then the lopon. So you have the legi lopon, right, the one who's actually your preceptor in your ordination, and then the negi lopon, who's the kachagen nowadays. Say it's the person who's your local teacher, and then you have your sangwei lopon, who's the one who questions you before you take ordination to make sure you're fit for ordination. Then you have your lokpe lopon, which nowadays we call petigen, right, the one who teaches you philosophy. So he's saying all these different teachers, lama. Denderwin nam gi du na. So when you're in front of all of these, dupatang tri lasope dengdu. So then you're sitting upon the your throne and so forth. I mean, tree, it's like throne isn't quite right, but it just means your seat, really. Tree. And the kilmo trung chene dupaho. So it's saying you should sit ideally in the vajra posture, right, which means that your feet are on your opposite thighs. But if not, just sit in a respectful posture. So then ngagile. So then the activities of speech. So we had the first was body, right? So how to behave in the monastery with your body. So now how to behave with your speech. So long manupe sonra shunigi long nujing. So yeah, receive scriptural long, meaning like you take the oral transmission of the 12 branches of scripture of those which you have not received, lung manupe. And a kun chupachepatang. So then the way of understanding them, right? This is often listed in the Vinaya, the ways of upholding the Dharma is to read it, memorize it, understand it, debate it, and so forth. So this is a standard list. Kun chupa, right? So chupar literally means to penetrate, right? But that's the way you understand something, that you get into the meaning of it. And then nibanam, so those are the ones that you have already received transmissions of. Kandun tongues, and you recite them. Shenladupa, you teach them to others. Sundru kepe dun du shen tang henji tamdrepa chepa maoho. And then for the purpose of generating enthusiasm for them, you discuss them with others. Damdre is to discuss. So then igile, so then the way that you behave with your mind in the monastery. So namgi tun barwala nyawata. So it's saying nam here is it just means nighttime, right? So in the middle part of the night is when you should sleep. So usually that means 11 p.m. to 3 a.m. Right? So that's the middle of the night. So ideally you should sleep then. If you need more sleep, you sleep before or after. Like you could sleep 10 to 4 or something. But it's ideal not to go to bed after 11 or get up before 3, because those times are considered when the ideal time for sleep. Because it's understood that it's more restful for the body during that time, and it's just considered the appropriate sleeping time. But if you can, it's ideal. You can sleep during those times. I know one Geshe who told me that that's what he does. He's passed away now, but he said he divided the night into 3 sections. So there was 3 4-hour sections. So from 7 p.m. to 11, he'd do his practice, and then 11 to 3, he'd sleep, and then 3 to 7, he'd do his practice again in the morning, and then you'd have the 12 hours of the day to do whatever else you need to do. So nyawa, so that sleeping at those times. Then wenbar songde, so then go to an isolated place. Jira tebedon, so that's saying, first of all, that was about sleeping, and then also what to do with your mind is go to an isolated place, and then think about the meaning of those teachings that you've heard. And then sem gu tings into chepatang. So then with the nine it says semgu, which is sem negu, right? The 9 mental settlings or mental abidings. Right, so those are the 9 stages that you go through in order to which you become abiding. So you place your mind in concentration with those, trying to gain a concentrated mind. And then laktong letsumpe mimawata. So that's again the higher trainings. You have first ethical discipline, and then concentration, and then finally laktong, right, is higher insight or vipassana. So it's saying the not speaking, that is effort in those, meaning that you're keeping quiet is a way of putting effort into those. It's part of the effort is to try to avoid speaking as much as possible, because that will distract you from engaging in those activities. And sawe duzu, nyawetse duma yimpa nigi nyompa tobata dupa samar chipo ho. So then when it's very hot in the hot season, and when you're tired out from the hot, still when you have the wish to go to bed at the wrong time, it's a way of freshening your mind so you don't just fall asleep. So these are the different activities. I think these are just examples. Of course, there's a lot more. But these are just examples of behaviors that you do with your mind. Then the 4th and 5th, nimo and simo gile. So they're during the daytime, during the nighttime. So nimo tang namgi chadu me lela minyawe. So then you don't sleep in the day, you don't sleep in the first part of the night, and you don't sleep in the latter part of the night. You only sleep in the middle part of the night. And the tempa tang, minyawe ten la, de luganki lukyang tendu. Right, so it's just saying that when it's this 4th and 5th section here, night and day, it's actually a way of dividing up the earlier sections. You have activities of body, speech, and mind for 1, 2, and 3. Then 4 is daytime, means activities of body, speech, and mind in the day. 5th is nighttime, activities of body, speech, and mind in the night. So nyawa she sumpe kyang. So then when it says sleeping, sleep, nyawa actually means lying down, but the idea is sleeping. Siemo le tang igile kona tendo. So it's only talking about activities of the nighttime and of the mind, right? The idea is that you can't really, you're not practicing any bodily activities when you're sleeping, and you're not practicing any daytime activities if you're sleeping at night. So when it's talking about sleeping, it's talking about night activities and mental activities. So then Chupo de la Shejin du Chupani. So now we listed these 10. So they set the stage, and now he'll talk about how you actually guard your introspection during those activities. So so when you're initiating some activity of moving or or behaving, so really going out of the monastery or being in the monastery. So first of all, you should place your mindfulness upon that activity that you're doing. You shouldn't be thinking of something else. You should think, this is what I'm doing. And again, we think of mindfulness as remembrance. So this is my intention. I'm going to do this. I'm not going to think about other things while I'm doing that. And I'm going to remember why I'm doing it, for how long, and what is the best way to do it. So you place your mindfulness fully on that. And then Bayu Berchula. So like I said before, Bayu is the conscientiousness, right? So you practice with the conscientiousness. Denigi Sinpe. So when it's conjoined with those two, with mindfulness and conscientiousness, Nampa Gangi Dapa Chawatang. So whatever aspect you're examining, meaning when you take Nampa aspect, right? It means whatever thing you're apprehending with your mind, whatever thing you're trying to meditate on or think about. So Jidar Dapa Chawe Nampa De. So then the manner of examining that too. De. So you should examine just in that way and know that, right? So you should do it the way that you're intending to do it, and not let your mind just, we talked about last week, gyayandu jok, like you just let it go however it wants. And that was compared to the wild elephant, gyayandu. So nampashide, they are nampashide. So there's 4 to that. Namponi. Lugi lela sope shi chupagan nam Chupo Ganla Nabagangi Jitar Dapechao. So that is 3 things it's saying there, right? So you have those bases of practice, those 10 bases of your practice, such as your bodily practice, your activities. So then it says Ganla, so to which one? Nabagangi, so in which way, and or with what way of thinking about it, and then Jitar Dapachawa, so then the way of analyzing it. Ji de la nampa de tardo percipite. So then you should analyze it in just that way. That's the right way to do it. Right? You should know in contextually each situation what's the best way to engage with it. So perna. So for example, droatan dope lela droatan onwe kunchu duane sumpatar. Right. So for the activities of going and coming back. So then you have the activities of going and coming that's explained in the Vinaya. So you should know in the Vinaya how that's explained. How do you go? How do you come? Shene, so knowing that, deitse tanda di tang di chedo pertabuho. So then at the time, not only do you know it in general, but at the time when you're engaging it, you know, now I'm doing this. This is how I'm supposed to do it. This is the best way to do it. So you should examine in that way. So then Nipani, right? So the second, it didn't actually say what the 4 are. It just said it had 4 parts. So chok gang du nampa gangi jitar dapa chawe chok de. So then the first was nampa, right? The whatever thing you're focusing on. So now it's direction. In what direction? In what way? And how you do whatever direction you're focusing on. De la nampa de dar dopa de. So then you do it in that way. So perna. So for example, drowaitse. So when you go somewhere, chang san la sope ning ar midrojing. So you don't go to the 5 places, such as a liquor store, right? So the note here doesn't say this in the text, but it's written in the note. So the 5 places he talks about that you shouldn't go, especially as a monk, is to a liquor store, a brothel, a bad slaughterhouse, king's palace, or a regular slaughterhouse. I'm not sure what the difference is, but generally you don't want to go to a slaughterhouse. So a liquor store, because of course you don't want to drink liquor. Furthermore, even if you aren't drinking, you'll invite criticism if you walk into a liquor store as a monk. People won't know why you're there. And then brothel, that's pretty self-explanatory. So the bad slaughterhouse, of course, the main thing is you don't want to participate in the activities of the slaughter, right? You might want to go there and say prayers for the animals, but you don't want to support it and be involved in it, so you don't go to that. And then King's Palace, there's a lot of talk about that in the Vinaya, because the Buddha gave a lot of reasons why King's Palace is not a good place for a monk. But there are times when the monks went to King's Palaces is because they were invited, and so there's quite a few different rules in the Vinaya about how to behave when you do go to the King's Palace. So it said that Ananda behaved the right way. He was invited to teach at the palace. So Nanda, as you know, was the attendant, and then Charka, who is Udayan, I think. Udayan is the Pali. I'm not sure in Sanskrit how you say it, but any Charka, that's what we call him in Tibetan, which just means dawn time. That was his name. Charka was an interesting character, right? Because he did a lot of very wrong things early on. So a lot of the rules we have in the Vinaya are thanks to Charka's mistakes, which is good, because if he hadn't done them, then we would have never have known that this is what you're not supposed to do, right? So even after he did actually become an arhat in the end. A lot of the other ones that were his buddies, the group of 6 they called them, they didn't become arhats, but he did. He was the general, right? He was the general of the Shakyas. So that he was a kind of a course. It says he was also the only monk, I think, who was said to be the same size as the Buddha in terms of height, right? The Buddha was very tall. So there's the one rule in the Vinaya that you can't make your robe the same size as the Buddha's. Like, there was one monk, he was kind of arrogant, and he wasn't that big, but he made his robe the same size as the Buddha's. But he said some people, like Charka, there's an exception because he's the same size. So we have a variety of rules of Charka, like you don't go and join an army when you're a monk, but he tried to do that. That was one of the lesser things he did. But, later, when he was an arhat, even then, he was still making mistakes. It said that an arhat can make mistakes. It's not done out of affliction. But he, for example, was invited to the palace, and he did it in the incorrect way. He went to the palace at nighttime. So then people were saying, well, what's this monk doing here with the queen and her retinue at night? He apologized, and that was the rule. Although eventually it did lead to him getting killed. Charka, that's the last story we have of him. Is he was, because once he was an arhat, they said actually different arhats were renowned for different things, and Charka was renowned for his ability to teach lay people, because he related to them so well. He just knew how they thought, knew how they talked. So he was often out in the city teaching. So one time he went to teach a woman, and he was teaching about the faults of sexual attachment. And this woman was actually having an illicit affair with the leader of a gang isn't the right word, but like a bandits. So she told that her lover that what Charka had been saying, and he was obviously a little bit unhappy with that. So he beheaded him. That was the end of Charka. But he was an arhat, so you'd say he didn't suffer that much. But the Buddha then made the rule that when a monk goes to teach in the city, for example, he should always have someone else with him. So that they can, or at least tell somebody. I think actually in that context, you should tell somebody, so that they know that, okay, this is where this person is, and if he doesn't come back, then we have to go check on them. So anyway, it's the point here is that going to a king's palace is generally a bit of a dangerous place. So nowadays, there aren't many king's palaces. There is the palace in Mysore, actually. That's why I haven't been there. I feel it. Yeah, it's just like a museum, right? But nevertheless, it seems to me. I don't know. Maybe sometime. But yeah, the idea is that anywhere that there's a lot of money, a lot of influence, a lot of what's the word? I'm not thinking of the right word, but intrigue, right? So those kinds of things, it's very dangerous for a monk to get involved with that because it's very easy to get led into non-virtue. It's like, for example, there's another vow for a monk: you don't travel with criminals. The idea, because the origin story to that was that the monk was he just was going along the road, so he happened to get in with these criminals, and then the king came with his retinue and beat them all and beat the monks too because they just happened to be there. So you get associated with them, but also you could end up getting involved in their behavior. So that's the reason, for the king's palace. So they're saying there's these 5 places, but generally there could be many. You have to think about, as I said, the king's palace. Maybe don't have that today, but think of other situations that might be similar to that. So they lay shendu droit sulnams. Then the other, you know the way to go to, right? So you don't go to those places, and then when you go to other places, you know the way of going, right? You know the right way of going, traveling about. So de tang de say shes into jopa tabu ho. So that at those times, then you place your mind in introspection. You go, but you keep your mind, you keep awareness of what's happening. So, of course, and he'll probably talk about that here, but in the Vinaya, there's quite a lot about how to behave with your body to be conducive to that. So you're supposed to look 6 feet in front of you, and if you need to look to the side for some reason, you shouldn't just look for no reason, but if you have to see something, you have to look, is there danger there or there? Then you stop and you look. You don't just walk with your head like that. And the way that you hold your arms, you don't want to swing your arms, you don't want to bob your head back and forth, things like that. So there's a lot of ways that can be done then to make it conducive to focusing on what's happening in your mind. Otherwise, if you're distracted to all kinds of external things, it's very easy to lose track of what's happening in your mind. So Sumbani, so that's we had 1 and 2, right? The three ways of guarding introspection, right? So then the first one was what to focus your mind on, and then what to do when you go places. So then do gangitse, so then the time, right? So place here is time. Do gangitse, namba gangi jitar. So all of them had the same formula. You have at what time, in what way, and how. Oh, with what is very better, because how and what way are the same. But at what time, with what thing, and how do you do so? Do de say number de are so you should do it in the way that it's meant to be done then. So meaning you should know in general. So it's a pernos. Then he gives an example. So this is exactly what I was just talking about with Charka, right? This vow about going to the city, right? So there's vows about going to a city in the morning or in the afternoon. There's different, because the monks generally should go to the city in the morning because they go to beg. They generally shouldn't go in the afternoon because there's no need to. But if you do have to, there's ways to do that. So here it's appropriate to go in the morning. It's not appropriate to go afternoon. So you know those things. Deitar choching, and then you do that. And they say nam sheshindu jopa tabuo. So then when you go, that's also there's the way that you do that, right? So there's a whole bunch of, in the Vinaya you have the 112 minor faults for a Gelong. Those are all related to different activities. Quite a lot of them are related to going into the town. So kim to droa, kim to dukpa. So you have the 20 that are related to going to town. And then kim to dukpa, 9 related to sitting at a layperson's home, right? Things like that. So it's saying you need to know all of those and be aware of what's the advice in that situation. So then shipani, so the fourth one, le. So then we had the first one, was lugi le. Yeah. Yeah, so then the first one was the activities and the place, time. So jinye chik nampagangi. So then here again, with all those activities, as many as there are, in what way, how do you do them? The nye chik, so just that many. So this is related to number of activities. So for example, say shindu damshin. So when you go, you should be very subdued. Very careful to subdue yourself. Kim shendu drowa chao. Shipala sopa drowa lapcha. So then, you should know, okay, then you go to another home. Shendu drowa chao. So then, all the different advice on where to go. So it's a drowa chao. It's saying go to another place. So that it might be talking about, I think the idea here is that you, how to know, okay, now I'm going this place, now I'm going this place, and you would do that very much intentionally. You don't just let yourself go wherever people pull you around, your mind just takes you. You're thinking, okay, now I'm going here, now I'm going here. That seems to be the idea. So temperate chipatabuo. So then you remember all of those various pieces of advice. So dorna. So in short, nimo tang tsenmo kuncho jitam yu. So then you remember just how many different activities there are related to the day and the night. So remembering that, so that you know what are things that you should do and things that you shouldn't do. So then also when you're engaging in something or turning away from something, right? That's generally jukdok means juk is the things you should do and dok are the things you should not do. Tanda jupaham dopa di tang di chedo. So then now I'm doing this, so now I'm not doing this. She tamchila shejudu jopo. So you should do all of that with introspection. You should be very conscious of your decisions. Oh, I'm doing this for this reason, and I'm doing this for this reason. So if you do that, say diryang, right? So if you do that, then even in this very life, you will not be stained by downfalls. You will not break your vows. And then chinekyang, and so dumitonga. So then also when you die, you won't be born in a miserable rebirth. And then lamgi topa matopa topa chao chai gyutso nepa. So then you'll also be abiding in all the collections of causes for attaining those realizations of the path that you have not yet achieved. So it's been that's what it said in the text. So meaning he's saying in general, this is what the traditional texts say. So di tang wompogo dompanini. So these two, right, the first two meaning guarding introspection, and then before that, guarding your sense doors. Papa to megi do trangne. So he's saying, Asanga, he quotes some sutra. That's what I said before. He didn't specifically say he was quoting from Kundu by Papa Topme, Asanga, but that's what he's saying. In relation to these, this was all taken from the explanations of Asanga, who gives sutra quotations and they don't drawatar. Then he explains the meaning of the sutra. So I've arranged it in just that way, in the way that Asanga explained it. Dini labena. So if you put effort into those two, introspection and guarding your senses, Gejur tepa tam chila bok shen tang min drawa tam chila bok shen tang min drawa ongjing keper du sutra myon sedapata. So in all virtuous activities that you do, bok shen, yeah. See, bok, I'm not sure actually here. I have to check. Bok, I have a note that it can mean adding fuel to a fire, but I don't think that's what he's talking about because it's talking about something positive here, right? Okay, bok, yeah, bok. Poke, yeah. Poke is your salary, right? Bok, it's like the benefit you get from something. Right, so ben bok shen de minrao hongxing, right? You'll get a special benefit that's dissimilar. It's more beneficial to do it this way, right? So kepardu sultrim yal sedapata, and especially your ethical discipline will be very pure. Shine tan lakdongi dupe sem namramido beting is in delaktu drupa sumbe paper chow. So then also you'll easily attain you'll easily attain a non-conceptual concentration that is the unification of calm abiding and special insight. And so Nahamidopa usually means the direct perception of emptiness, but he may just be talking more about it probably is what he's talking about. I don't think he's just talking about getting a non-conceptual mind of peace. I think he's talking about direct perception of emptiness. Nahamidopa Tingizen. So he's saying if you practice this way, it's what will lead to those realizations. So he's saying then you should make effort in that. So then, zegit sorikpani. So then, eating the right amount. So it's food with 4 qualifications. Hachang nyua maipa. So not too little. Hachang nyungna trepatang nyam chuma gyurane. So if it's too little, then you'll be very hungry, and you'll nyam chung. It's like you'll be weak. Your body will become weak. Gewe chawala tu mepa gyurawe. So then you'll have no energy to practice virtue. Sangi segidula malagi bardu trepe. So then until you eat tomorrow, because the idea here is as a monk, you're not eating until this eating time, right, which is between sunrise and midday. So if you don't eat enough in that time, then after midday up until sunrise tomorrow, when you're eating again, then you'll be hungry. And then trepe minupe so samdu sawa. So you should eat an amount such that you won't be pinged by hunger until you eat again tomorrow. So even if you are eating after midday, the point is whenever you stop eating, eat enough that you won't be hungry until the next time you eat again. So hacham mao mayimpas, then not too much. Mangna lu kurtopatar. So then your body will be like a heavy load for you. Chiwatang u jungyo suju u jungo kawa. So then you'll be heavy and it'll be hard to breathe. Kawata nimuk pelwa, and you'll have more lethargy. Le sumirong way. So then your body won't be suitable as you like it to use it for virtuous activities. Nyomon pawala tu mepas. Then you won't have the force to abandon afflictions because you'll be too weighed down by your body. Tu mepagireso. So that's too little, too much. And then she shua tang drupe. So digesting your food is talking about. Sela tempe sorwat dunyawa ningwanam pongshing. So then you abandon all those the suffering feelings that are related to food, right? If you eat food that makes you uncomfortable. So dunyawa sarpa na mikewa, you won't gain new ones, right? So it's saying when you eat food in the right amounts and you chew it well, I think too is the idea. Right, that you eat the right food. You eat food that's digestible. You don't eat food that's going to make you uncomfortable. So even if it's the right amount, if it's not the right kind of food. And then LAM.RIM.CHEN.MO. So then the appropriate food that's not related to afflictions. So kanametoa kebas, because the understanding is that certain kinds of food give rise to afflictions. He doesn't say here exactly, but certainly in the traditional text, it's like very spicy foods or garlic. They often talk about tends to be singled out, but the idea is that I think in general, different foods have different effects in the body, so it can depend on the person. You just have to know what kind of foods will cause your elements, as they say here, to be out of balance. But generally, the point is that you will. It will lead you know from your own experience what kind of foods your constitution needs, and not eat the ones that will cause you to then be likely to. It says kana mitoa makewa, right? So not that you won't actually engage in non-virtue as a result of it. And dewala repanebohon, you'll naturally abide in happiness, meaning you'll be comfortable. Deang sela sepe niempo de nimik gompala raglepe. So then it also depends upon habituating or understanding with what are the drawbacks uh, of not eating correctly, right? So you have that, saying that the antidote to over attachment or over craving is sepa, right? Craving for food is to understand the drawbacks of eating incorrectly, and then you'll naturally have less wish to eat the wrong way. So there's three main drawbacks. So long chepe gule jongwei make. So then the first is the cause related to your actions. Sorry, your what the way that your enjoyments of pleasure, right? If you eat too much, for example, it's hard to enjoy a lot. This text is actually quite long. Quite a lot of drawbacks in eating too much. So maybe it's good we take a break. I don't want people might be getting tired, so we can have question and answer.
When you talk about being aware of the mind, and you know it's in an afflicted state, you said you gently bring it back to something which is either neutral or virtue, right?
Right.
Get the attention back. If that happens, how do you deal with the afflicted state? Because you know it's afflicted, you know it's wrong. So when then do you deal with that afflicted state?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's quite a subtle thing. I mentioned that a little bit before. Like, you have to have a distinction, and it's not an easy distinction, between avoiding non-virtue and then kind of repressing or the bad thoughts, right? That can actually be counterproductive. So one thing is that, generally speaking, when you're going about activities, is not probably the best time to address it. Right? You have to have a way of blocking those things out. That's part of maturity, is being able to manage difficult situations without becoming overwhelmed and letting all your negative thoughts come into your mind. But you also have to create some space to deal with that at a different time. So you have to know when is the right time, and then perhaps deal with it in a way that's very gentle. Like you have to not let it become so much that it just overwhelms you, but you have to find a way to address it with the antidote. Like if you're not aware that you have anger and you just block it out, then you're not going to actually be able to apply any kind of antidote. I think also there's different psychology about people in the modern world and then other times. It definitely seems to be certain significant differences. We even notice it as being here. Being with traditional Tibetan culture is quite different. I mean, I've commented that for one thing, all of us here as foreigners, we're kind of all one group. When you're growing up in America, then somebody's from Europe. It's very exotic, but when you're here, it's basically the same. You're from America or France. It's basically the same. To the Tibetans, you're all English, right? But even with Indians, I find Indian monks in the monastery, we find our psychology is more similar than it is to the traditional Tibetans. And I say traditional because then we see lay Tibetans in the camps and so forth who are more integrated into modern thinking. It's quite different. But here, the way of interacting and dealing with one's mind is quite different. So we have to, I think for a lot of these things, it's also very important to understand some of the developments in the modern world with psychology and other ways of looking at human behavior, because it just wasn't something they needed to address then. There wasn't that same style of thinking. So there was actually, what I'm thinking of, there was actually a discussion between your teacher, again, Fedor, who was a monk here many years ago, and a psychologist who asked him a similar question, that he was saying that, like, Yeah, he was. I think he was talking about DBT, which is dialectical behavioral therapy, right? Which is I think has to. It's like it employs mindfulness training, doesn't it? Yeah. So he was saying how that had been effective and how he was using that to treat his patients, and he was wondering. You'd said that you need to keep your mind away from the non-virtue, and how do you work these together? And they had quite a long discussion. We have the transcript of it here, and their agreement at the end seemed to be that the first step is to recognize that you have anger. If you don't recognize it at all, then you're not really applying an antidote. You're just avoiding it. So you need to start with that. Then you can start applying an antidote once you know that there's anger in your mind. So I think, as I say, that's a subtle thing that it's hard to really describe, because you can say how important it is to keep your mind away from non-virtue. How somebody hears that is going to depend a lot on their own experience, and they might hear it in the wrong way and think that you need to just always be nice and thinking in this really very narrow way, that you don't allow yourself to actually experience what's happening in your mind. But then if you say to somebody else, well, you should just, for example, we talk about Dzogchen and Mahamudra, where the advice is usually just let whatever's there in your mind be there. That can also be taken in quite the wrong way and think that, well, then I just do whatever I feel like, and that's meditation. So I think it's not something I could just give a simple answer to, but you're right that you have to examine it. You can't just read it in the text and say, okay, that's how it is. It takes a lot of practice and debate. Something that you can debate these points. Think about it more. Not just this, but also just talking with people and getting experience that way. Okay. Yeah.
So a lot of times in the West, when we hear the teachings, it comes as every opportunity is a practice. Mm-hmm. So if you are in a bad situation, angry, so it becomes, it's your karma you're facing because you're mean to that person in past life.
Right.
So now you have to be practicing. Sometimes it becomes dangerous. So how do you, here it's saying don't be in that situation. But a lot of times when the teachings come, many women ask, well, if those people are abusive, then what am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
So,
well, that's a good point. That's a similar thing, that there's a subtle distinction. Like, when do you decide I'm just not going to be in the situation? So, for example, I was saying here, if you're very attached to somebody, you should remove yourself from that person. Does that mean every time you find yourself attached to somebody, you remove yourself? So you don't look at anybody. You keep blindfold on all day. I don't know, but it's like, there's different degrees to it. So, for example, as monastics, we've made a very strong commitment to removing ourselves from a lot of objects. That's one step you can take, but even as a monastic, it's going to happen all the time that we encounter objects that incite afflictions. So you can't have your only recourse be to leave the situation, and you have to know when it is not the right time. So again, it could be taken to either extreme. I think this also is something I've observed sometimes in presentations in modern Buddhism, or Western Buddhism, we could say, that I think is a little bit too much of the extreme of whatever situation you're in, just deal with it. So sometimes it is better to change your situation if it's not conducive to your practice. And if you notice that being around a particular person just leads to more afflictions, it's probably better to try to distance yourself from them. But as Shantideva says, when you can do something about it, then why worry about it, right? So if you can change the situation, then change it. There's no need to sit to think, this is terrible, even though you can change it. But at the same time, if you can't do something about it, then there's no need to be discouraged. Then you need to try to train your mind in whatever way. So if you're locked in prison, you can't just leave. Then you have to deal with the situation in the best way.
So if it is your family or someone dependent or very closely connected to or related to, someone dependent on you, for whatever reasons.
Yeah, exactly.
So should you believe in?
Well, that's again, you have to judge the situation, right? That can be hard. Sometimes, we might feel we're very obligated to a person, but actually, it's more detrimental to us than it's helpful to them. But at the same time, there could be the opposite extreme, where you just are being kind of selfish and avoiding responsibility when you actually should be taking care of somebody. So it's not a simple answer. You have to judge the situation based on your experience and maybe based on advice from others. But what came to my mind was you were talking about abusive situations, right?
Yeah.
And that's also something very difficult. But generally speaking, if somebody is really being abusive, you have, of course, the advice not to speak out, not to react if somebody treats you this way. But in certain contexts, it might be more appropriate to do so. Right? If you're being abused, then you just let them do that. It's just enabling them to create negative karma. And if you don't speak out, then other people aren't going to know that they should also avoid this person, or that this person won't be disciplined in the proper way. And then the other question you had was about karma, right? So that's a very difficult thing. It could be subtly taken the wrong way, and sometimes there's an accusation that karma is a fatalistic view, which it can be if somebody takes it as karma means that everything is fixed and determined, which is not the point at all. It has to do with cause and effect. It's not saying that everything that happens you have no control over. It's just saying there are more causes than we're aware of. It's not just physical causes. Things don't just happen because of the interactions of atoms that then conglomerate in a brain and then create an experience, which is how it's generally understood in mainstream science today. But here it's saying there's a lot more causes and conditions involved in why things happen. But it doesn't have anything to do with that you therefore have to accept it and not try to change it. But you have to know what is the cause. So in Buddhism, we have the Four Noble Truths, and you have the truth of suffering and the truth of the cause of suffering. The cause of suffering is not physical. It's not that we can just change the physical world and therefore suffering will go away, because it comes from karma and afflictions. So if you know the cause, you can do something to address the cause. If you don't know the cause, then however much you try to manipulate things, you're not going to really solve the problem. So it has to do with understanding causation. It doesn't have anything to do with just being kind of passive about it. There's also for example, people sometimes say that in Buddhism you should just practice being content with whatever happens and not try to change it. But again, that's a misunderstanding. The general teaching is be content with your physical situation when you can't change it. So especially if you're a monastic, if you have enough food and you have a decent shelter, then don't try going searching for something better. You don't need a bigger house. You don't need better food. But in terms of your mind, that's actually, it's the opposite. You shouldn't say, well, my mind is a mess, but that's just how I am and I'm okay. You actually is quite the opposite. You should say, this is not acceptable. Like Shantideva says, this is not a cause for patience. This is when the demon of afflictions is abiding in my mind and is throwing me into hell, then it's not a time to just passively say, that's okay, I'm going to let it do that. You want to counter that and actually apply an antidote very strongly. So you have to identify what is the cause. If the cause really is something external, now we would say, ultimately the cause is internal. If somebody is abusing you, it is your karma. Nevertheless, the condition for that karma to ripen is external. And you can change that condition to prevent the ripening of that particular karma. It doesn't mean you just say, well, I'm purifying the karma. Like there was these people that were torturing themselves at the time of the Buddha. The other ascetics from other traditions, and they asked the Buddha, what was the cause of this suffering we're experiencing now? Expecting he would say it was this karma you did in the past. He says, well, it's because you're beating yourself. So if you remove that condition, then that karma, of course, you're born into a human body, so you wouldn't experience suffering if you weren't born into a human body, and you had karma to be born as a human. Nevertheless, in an immediate circumstance, there are conditions, and you can change those conditions. Otherwise, why do anything, right? you say, well, it's just my karma to be hungry, so why eat, right? It's
Yeah.
you have to be able, in a particular situation, there are things you can do. So you might have karma to be abused, but you also have the karma that there's a way to escape, right? It's sort of this, like, there's an issue that often comes up with people who believe in a creator God. There's a similar trap of thinking, oh, well, if God wants to save me, he'll save me, so I'm not going to do anything about it. It's a similar issue. His Holiness addressed that when he came here for the Mind Life Conference, right? No, here at Sera in 2015. That was the first thing he said in the opening speech of the Mind Life Conference. He gave a talk about, what he said. I don't remember all the details of what he said, but it was, he said, people always are praying to God. Please hate. There's so many problems in the world. Please take away all the suffering of the world. So he said, I think if you pray that way, then when you die and you go before God, because he's talking to Western audience, so he said, when you go before God, and you say to God, why are there so many problems? He'll say to you, well, you human beings, you created the problems. You should have solved them. Right? Why are you asking me to solve the problems that you created? So in your life, of course, you have to be practical. But I guess the only emphasis in Buddhism is to look very broadly at the situation, not just at one specific cause. Right? So you have to know all of the different causes, and then you can make a very informed decision about what's the best way to behave in that particular situation. Yeah. Okay.
While you're meditating, you'd often start with a very neutral source, such as breath, for example, and you'd eventually find that the mind is wandered, and then it has gone to some places, events, memories, right? And then the natural process is to bucket it as unpleasant or pleasant.
Is to, sorry?
Bucket
it to,
yeah,
say this is pleasant or unpleasant. Okay, yeah.
Right. So then, whenever you catch that, that okay, this is unpleasant or pleasant, that recognition can be like a alarm that I have to go back to the neutral. So, but then, how do I, through meditation, how do I break that conditioning and that association of that memory, event, whatever is appearing in my head, from labeling as pleasant or unpleasant? How to break that association and just let things be as they are without bucketing them?
So you're saying that when you're meditating, you're trying to or bracket them, maybe you could say, into different categories. But then how to stop that from happening?
Right.
You're saying. Well, I think at the beginning in meditation, you're trying to do that as a way of just being aware as much as possible. So if you can label them, you can say, okay, this is anger, this is attachment, this is pleasant, this is unpleasant, so that you can be aware of those different sensations. But at the deeper level, you want to start to see that they're not, from their own side, they don't have that particular quality. Anger is just energy in the body. Desire also is just a kind of energy in the body. And if you bracket this as it's just this desire that I don't touch that, I only focus on the good things, then, as we were saying before, that at a deeper level of meditation, that can get in the way. So again, that's something I think it comes with some degree of practice. You also have to have quite a bit of concentration, right? So if you just allow every feeling you're having just into your consciousness, you'll be overwhelmed all of the time. So you have to start by generating some degree of mental space where you can deal with these things. Then you can allow them to manifest in consciousness in a manageable way. It's like one of the traditional analogies is that if you throw salt into a cup of water, then it becomes salty. But if you throw salt into a lake, it doesn't make the lake salty. So when your mind is just like a little cup of water, then you have to guard it from all these things coming in. But when you have a lot more space to deal with it, then you can allow those things into your consciousness. So you have to gradually cultivate that. If you practice meditation regularly, especially if you do intensive meditation, this was recently found in longitudinal studies not just one study, but say a meta-analysis of many meditation studies that have been done by Daniel Goleman and Richard Davidson. They've done a lot of work on this, and the book is in here somewhere. Our library is all out of order, but yeah.
The emotional intelligence.
No, not that one, but it's on that shelf. You're right. Altered traits. Yeah. And there they talk about that. Yeah. They found that the evidence shows quite strongly that the most effective way to meditate is to do intensive meditation retreat. So somebody who meditates 1 hour a day for 20 years, they accumulate how many hours. Somebody who does that same number of hours in a 1 month or 2 month retreat, it's more effective. So maybe not, I don't know, in 1 month if you could do 20 years of hours, but the basic idea is that you do an intensive time when you have that space, that you can cultivate that space in your mind. Then you start to create some kind of more space where these things can manifest and you can deal with them. Otherwise, if it's just kind of putting a band-aid on every day by sitting for 20 minutes, you don't really go much deeper into that. And in that case, it's probably better not to. You don't want to try to go way deep into all these different issues in the mind if you don't have the space to deal with it. If you're just meditating for 20 minutes, mainly what you can do is just think about what I did today and was it virtuous or non-virtuous, and try to fix that a little bit, but you don't have the space to do it much more intensively. But if you do that intensively, I think generally, I would hope, although again, I don't have enough experience trying to instruct people who are doing that, but I would hope it becomes somewhat of a natural process when you're with your mind for that long, as long as you're doing the practice as instructed and not just letting yourself do whatever you feel like during that time. But also, you can work with the instructor at least at the beginning stages to try to see is this the right way to be doing it. But I think ultimately it has to come from your own judgment, that you can be aware. Okay, this feeling is coming into my mind, but is not so strong that I'm just out of control. It's enough that I can, in a manageable way.
So if you can spend time with it, you should.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, and as I say, it's a subtle thing to be able to say what is the right and wrong time. Mm-hmm. But I think in general, it shouldn't be that that when you do a retreat, it's just pure bliss. Mm-hmm. That's maybe not the best kind of retreat. What have you gained from it, right? So, for example, again, Japa Keldon, one of the senior monks in his house, he just left a few months ago. He'd been at Sera for 27 years, and the last 13 years he'd been in retreat. And he was saying that he was talking to one of his friends, who was a Geshe, about his retreat. He said, "How's your retreat going?" And he started talking about all of the problems he's been having, because he had severe health problems during his retreat. He almost died. And after he came out of retreat, he looked quite different. His body was, he's quite elderly anyway, but his body was, his back was hunched over after all those years of doing that. And so he described that to his friend, and he said, "Oh, good, it was a real retreat." The Tibetans in the monastery, they understand. It's part of their culture. For them, that's not surprising. They know, whether they're serious practitioners or not, they understand generally what serious practice should look like. And it doesn't look like that you just go to a mountaintop and sit there in this bliss like you see on the cover of magazines, right?
Yeah.
It's very hard work doing this kind of intensive meditation where you're working with difficult things in your mind. Sometimes, as in his case, that manifests as physical ailments. Yeah. Yes.
How would you recommend to cultivate good conviction how to cultivate that I have good judgment of when to take action, then actually do it? Mm-hmm. Two examples. Before you were responding to Naga and saying, when my mind is a mess, then I should say, this is not acceptable, I need to do something about it. Mm-hmm. And when you were reading or translating from the source, were mentioning, for example, being lethargic, being inactive or passive. And I can be fine with that. I can say, okay, it's good enough, I don't need to worry about it. But sometimes we are in situations where we could be content and say, oh yeah, it's fine, I don't have to worry about it. When actually a better thing would be to say, no, I need to take action, this is not acceptable. But for that to happen, I need proper judgment that the situation is unacceptable. So I can find different words for it, standards or whatnot, maybe motivation too. But how to get to that point to say, okay, no, this is not acceptable.
There's a different number of ways to approach that. The traditional teaching in the Buddhist texts is that it has to come from a combination of personal reflection and study, that you read about different experiences of different people in the past, and this is their advice on that. But the advice isn't meant as like an order. This is just, you just take it as it is and believe it. It's that other people who have gone through this process in the past, they explain their understanding of it, and then you have to reflect on that and in relation to your own experience. So the more understanding you have, the more broad your wisdom is. You understand all these different stories of past people who practice. You understand all these different ways of understanding the practice. Then that will naturally affect when you're thinking about it yourself. That will just naturally come into your mind at the time. And again, with your own reflection and experience, that will become more solidified. But at the beginning stages, also one thing that's very important is being in a community of practitioners. That's often overlooked. People think that Buddhism is about personal practice. It doesn't have to do with how you relate to others per se. But traditionally, it's not stated directly because it was just taken for granted how much of a communal practice this is. Then you're in a group with other people who can say to you, look, this behavior that you're doing, it doesn't look right. Something's wrong here, and you can then reflect on that. Or that you look very unhappy these days. I noticed before when you first came here, you seemed quite happy, but now something's going on, and somebody can point that out and give you advice on how to deal with that. It's only at very advanced levels that you would want to really be just totally in isolation. I think, as I say, there's not one simple answer to it. It's a very similar question that a lot of you are asking, where there's not an easy. You can go to either extreme, right? So I think, one way to judge it is if you're creating actions that are non-virtuous, and that's a very obvious sign that you should try to apply some kind of antidote. If it's just something that's happening in your mind, then that's a bit more questionable. If you are quite confident that it will lead to non-virtue, then it's probably good just to stop it as much as possible. But if it's just a subtler thing, sometimes, as we're saying before, that it's useful to be aware of it and notice it and not try to block it, because if you block it, you won't let it kind of play out. It's like you have to be a spy of what's happening in your own mind, and if you just step in and try to interfere with it, then it won't show itself to you. So you have to be able to do that, but very delicately, such that it doesn't just become so much all of a sudden that now it's out of control. So again, there's no simple, easy answer on how to do that, but you have to examine that with your own practice over time. Okay. Yeah, maybe it's good we have a break. I don't want to keep everybody, but we'll have more time for question maybe next week, or if people want to ask personally, that's okay. So we can do the prayers, yeah.
my two collections,
vast
vast space that I've
I've
amassed
from
from
my
working with
commitment
efforts
of
at
this
this practice
practice
for
for
a
a
great
really
length
long
of
time.
time. I
I
become
become
the
the
chief
chief
leading
leading
Buddha
Buddha
for all those whose mind and
whose
wisdom
mind
are
is blinded by ignorance.
Even
And
if
if
I
I
do
do
not
not
reach
reach
this
this
state,
state,
may I
may I
be
be
held
held
in
in
your
your
loving
loving
compassion
compassion
for
for
all
all my
lives,
lives,
Manjushri.
Manjushri.
May I find the ways of complete creative paths of the
teachings,
teachings that may
and
be
please
pleased
all
all
the
the Buddhas
Buddhas
for
for
my
my
practice.
practice.
These
The
sinful
sinful
beings
beings
drawn
drawn
by
by
the
the
strong
strong
force
force
of
of compassion,
compassion
with
may
the
clear the
power
darkness from the minds of all beings to the point
points
of
of
the
the
path
path
as
I
I
have
discern
discerned
them.
them.
May I uphold
Hold
the
the
Buddha's
Buddha's
teachings
teachings
for
for a
a
very
very long
long
time.
time.
With my heart
Echoing
pouring
out
out
with
with
great
great compassion,
compassion,
whatever
whatever
direction
direction
the
the
most
most
precious
precious
teachings
teachings
have
have
not
not
yet
yet
spread
spread,
or
or
once
once spread
spread
have
have declined,
declined,
may
may
reveal
exist
the
this
treasure
treasure
of
of happiness and aid.
May the minds of those who wish for liberation be granted bodiless peace, and the
And may
Buddha's
this
peace
light
be
be
nourished
nourished
for
for
a
a
long
long
time
time.
by even
This
this
great
great path
path
of
of
enlightenment
enlightenment
completed
completed to the
through the wondrous
wondrous,
virtuous
virtuous
conduct
conduct
of
of
the
the
Buddhas
Buddhas
and
and
their
their
sons.
sons.
May all
So these
human and
non-human
non-human
beings
beings
who
who
eliminate
eliminate
adversity
adversity
and
and
create
create
the
conducive
conditions
conditions for
for practicing
practicing
the
the
excellent
excellent
path,
path,
never
never
be
be
part
part
in
of
any of
any
their
of the
lives
lives
in
of
the
the
pure
purest path
space
praised
by
by
the
the Buddhas.
Buddhas.
Whenever
Whenever
someone
someone
makes
makes
an
an
effort
effort
to
to
act
act
in
in
accordance
accordance
with
with
the
the
tenfold
ninefold Mahayana
Mahayana
virtuous
virtuous
practices,
practices, may he
may always
always
be
be
assisted
assisted
by
by
the
the
mighty
mighty
ones,
ones,
and
and
may
may
oceans
oceans
of
of
prosperity
prosperity
spread
spread
everywhere.
everywhere.